Okay, listen up, please. This is Deverly Luskin. She is from the Vermont Humanities Council, and she's giving us the 16th or so rendition of this lecture. And go right ahead.
Okay, well, again, thanks to the Vermont Humanities Council, and thanks to Mary Nadeau, who I believe is just having the time of her life over in France right now, probably eating pastry or swigging wine or both. And here we are in cold Vermont, and thank you for coming out today. So, you've all heard the story, or the saying, you can't get here from there, or you can't get there from here, whichever it is. And it's just not true. People have been traveling through Vermont for millennia, and people have been settling here for centuries. And there's a really important distinction. So how did I come to write this, to come up with this? I was stuck in traffic. I had nothing to do but ask myself a question. What was Vermont like before the interstate? I was watching, this is actually a picture of Middlebury in 1988. I was sitting in traffic in 1995, 2 miles from my house, where Vermont Trans was taking a curve out of a state highway. And I had just moved to Williamsville, not to be confused with Williamstown, where we had one store, one gas pump, we had a game reporting station, a church that held services, and a post office. And right now, only the post office is still open. It has 2 zip codes now and has reduced hours. So small town life, I have witnessed small town life to shrink, which made me wonder what was Vermont like before the interstate. I wrote a novel about it, which is still not published, but I have an agent trying to sell it. And once I finished that novel, I wrote another one, which answers the question, how did the interstate change Vermont? Who here drove on the interstate to get here tonight? Anybody? I did, certainly. I came from Newfane. So, I got on in Putney and got off at White River, 4 to 11. And I thought, this is a book, came out in 2010, and it's a love story about 2 people who are 64 years old, who seemed really old when I wrote it. I was 48 when I wrote the book. It's like, it's not looking so far away anymore. And the research for that book is actually the basis for a different talk I do for the Humanities Council called 1964, A Watershed Year in Vermont Social and Political History. And the interstate book takes place in 1958, which is when the first 9 miles of the interstate opened. So you can get there from here. People have been traveling in Vermont for years. So I'm quoting from a fairly recent, the 2014 history of Vermont called Freedom and Unity. From the earliest days of human habitation until the middle of the 20th century, the mountains dictated the routes and limitations of settlement, transportation, communication, trade, cultural contact, and political and social continuity. So until the advent of reliable motor vehicles, or even with the trains, it was hard to get from here to there. But Vermont's geography, with this mountain range right down the center of the state, really hindered east-west communication. And going north and south wasn't always so easy either. So we have geography, and we have, well, let's talk about geography. We have mountains. We have the Green Mountains, which are part of the Appalachian mountain range, and the Appalachians go from Georgia to Maine. Anyone here walked it? No? Okay. And then you've got the Taconic Mountains in the south, which are also right here, Taconic Mountains. In the southwest, you've got The Worcester Range is central Vermont, right in the middle, just north of Montpelier, and the Piedmont, or the foothills of the White Mountains in the northeast. When you have mountains, you have valleys. We have the Valley of Vermont, which is essentially west of Route 7 on the west side of the state, the Champlain lowlands in the northwest. You have the New England uplands in the northeast, and then you have the Connecticut River Valley in the east. All these are important to transportation, or hindrance to transportation. And after geography, you have climate, and we still have climate. So it's maybe you can still get there from here in the winter, but it might not always be wise to try. So, before our current geopolitical boundaries, the Mohawk and Iroquois nations occupied the territory west of Lake Champlain. So that's the Mohawk and Iroquois in the west of here's, let's see, I think here's the lake right here. Okay, so that's
Which lake would that be?
Lake Champlain. Okay.
The lake.
Our
I
lake,
get it now.
the Great Lake, the Great Lake of Vermont. Okay, and the Abenakis and the Algonquin occupied the territory to the east. Okay, this is important. There is evidence of indigenous peoples that they traveled and traded throughout the entire Northeast. In fact, this dark line here is the original Long Trail, not the footpath that goes along the spine of the Green Mountains, but the trade route that the Iroquois and Mohawk took from Lake Erie all the way to the eastern tip of Long Island to trade with the native people there. And we know this from finding Midwestern or Lake Erie copper in the eastern tip in Suffolk County, Long Island, and shells from eastern Long Island up by Lake Erie. So the Long Trail is approximately where Route 2 in Massachusetts goes now, which is just south of the Vermont border. Which is also known as the Mohawk Trail. The route back in the day was a combination of a footpath and a river course and a portage. Okay, there was a 5-mile portage between the Deerfield River, which is in Florida, Massachusetts, and the Hoosac River, which is near North Adams, Massachusetts. So there was this one place that the Native Americans knew was the best place, the shortest place between rivers in the Appalachian Range, and it is this Hoosac Mountain. It had a 1,000-foot vertical rise in 1 mile on one side, and it was a little, that was on the western side. It was a little gentler on the eastern side. And it connected the eastern and western parts of the Northeast at that time. Well, it still does, but it was the way through. And in the mid-1750s, Massachusetts paid for a Hoosac Road, which replaced the Indian Path, and it allowed oxen and wagons to pass. But the original footpath continues to be in use today. It is the site of the nearly 5-mile Hoosac Tunnel, which was built in 1875, and is a railroad tunnel that's still being used. So if you learn nothing else tonight, please, I hope you will remember that almost every route that we use today, whether it be almost any road, was originally a native footpath. And they use waterway a lot more than we do too. But the native methods of transportation, not methods of transportation, their routes really laid the foundation for each subsequent method of transportation, from the foot to the canoe, to the canal, to the railroad, and to the interstate highway. Indian roads were really critical. They were the precursors to most of our modern highways, but they weren't so smooth. There's an account of an Indian road that ran from Wallingford to Ferrisburg through the Champlain Valley in use by indigenous people, we think, for about 8,000 years before before Europeans arrived. And the Europeans often followed these footpaths with difficulty. Here is, there was a fur trader named James Cross who left a journal of his passage on the Otter Creek in 1730. So the Otter Creek, well, this is not, I wonder if it would be helpful to turn the lights out so you could see these better. Is that better? Is that any better? Okay. So here's the Otter Creek, and it goes north, and this is really taller than I am. we would have to lower that as well. Or if you just had a stick, a yardstick, a pointer stick, a knife, a fork. Yeah, oh, that's much better. No, that's much better. That's much better. So here's the Otter Creek. And it goes up, you can see it goes up to Lake Champlain. So James Cross left, he left Fort Dummer, which is here on the west, it's actually down here. Dummer State Park is there. The fort itself is underwater since they built the Vernon Dam. He took, he got, I think it took him 3 days, is that correct? 3 days, 3 miles. Okay, he left on April 27th in 1730, and he camped at the West River, which is here. I live on a tributary to the West River. So he camped there, then he continued up to the Black River in Bellows Falls, and then he went across to a height of land. So he crossed on, he crossed several branches of the Otter Creek, but at the height of land, he did what you do. He built canoes, right? And, but they were delayed by rain. So the next day, after the rain ended, they traveled 35 miles by canoe until they reached the Rutland and Proctor Falls. You can't really see, but they're there. So he goes up the Black River, crosses the Otter Creek. Rutland is probably about right there. Goes around the falls. And the following days, he travels 40 miles to the Middlebury Falls. They're on the Otter Creek now, so travel is swift. And then they carried their canoes around more falls at Middlebury and finally made it to the lake. So the east-west passage from the Connecticut River to Lake Champlain has always required a significant portage. It's the Black River to Otter Creek to Winooski. It's always been hard. And then you'll remember the famous attack on Deerfield in 1704, on February 29th, 1704. Well, the Indians who were allied in the French in Canada came down. This is just a little further away. I'll just do this. So they came down the Otter Creek to Deerfield, which is in western Mass. It's a little bit further over here. They took 112 captives. They went up the frozen Connecticut River all the way to Wells River, which is, I can point at it there. Okay. Oh, super. Wells River. Then they crossed to the Winooski, up to Lake Champlain, which is frozen, really easy to travel these days in the winter when everything's frozen, and up to Canada. It took 25 days, and 89 people survived, 60 of whom were later redeemed. So, beginning in about 1540, with the voyages of Jacques Cartier, who was looking for the Northwest Passage to Asia, North America became the fighting ground for Britain and France. They had a long history of fighting each other in Europe, and they thought, well, we'll just go to the new year and continue. So, after Cartier got as far as the St. Lawrence to Quebec, and he stopped. And he made 3 trips, then he went away. And it wasn't until 1608 that Samuel Champlain came. And he sailed into the lake that now bears his name. He went to Montreal and then found this found the lake. And it is really in this 17th century that imperialism between the French and that French and British imperialism really took off. And by the mid-18th century, the two kingdoms were engaged in a world war, both in Europe and in North America. And those Mohawk and Iroquois of the west of Lake Champlain were allied with Canada. And the English, who were south of the St. Lawrence, were allied with the Algonquin and the Abenaki. So when you have war, you have, and then there's Spanish are down in Mexico and the Southwest, and don't play a role in the laying down the foundational travel routes in Vermont. And Vermont, of course, was claimed by both New Hampshire and New York, both of whom were British. So, Vermont was also fought over by the Canadians and French. The Canadians and French wanted Vermont, New York and New Hampshire wanted Vermont, and of course England wanted Vermont. They were very much wanted. So the first roads that the British built were military roads, and that would be the Crown Point Road, which was the first military road in our neighborhood. It was planned in 1753. The British planned to cut a road from Fort No. 4 to the Intervale at Cowass, where they were going. So that would be Fort No. 4, which is in Charleston, New Hampshire, going all the way up here to Chimney Point and then across to Crown Point. The fort was never built, but the road was. But there was a large settlement of 400 Abenaki at near Chimney Point, and the French were at Chimney Point. The Abenaki did not want this road built, and this is the beginning of a long tradition of resistance to road building, which continues today, or certainly up to the interstate. The Abenakis said, they warned Captain Phineas Stevens at Fort No. 4 that if they built, they joined, so the Abenakis actually joined the French, which is, so they switched sides, and they said, if you build this road, we promise to beat all your enemies who are our enemies, and drive them as wind settles the dust. So warfare ensued. Indo-European relations suffered, especially Indo-English relations. The British and French War escalated, and the fort at the Intervale was never built, but the Crown Point Road was. General Jeffrey Amherst commissioned it, and here's the modern map of where it goes. So they built it. The Chimney Point is called that because the French settlers there, all the way they settled their land around the lake was not in village centers the way the British did. They all had long strips of land that went back from the lake, and they burned their houses and left, leaving only their chimneys, which I understand are still there. There's a state park. I've not yet been, but Amherst understood that once the military operation was over, the road would be valuable for incoming pioneers. So he said he said it would contribute to the wealth and prosperity of the territory. And the road was to be cleared to a width of 20 feet. Wherever it may be necessary to lay any bridge across, you will lay them sufficiently strong to bear carriages. You will also, at every 15 miles distance, cause logged fences to be put up for harboring and keeping together the cattle that will be drove through that road for the use of the troops. Because, of course, they say an army marches on its stomach. Well, in the 1750s, the cows marched. You didn't have refrigeration. You just had your meat on the hoof. And droving was, people drove all their livestock. So the road was completed in July of 1760, and drovers took their first herd of cattle to provision troops heading for Canada. Despite Jeffrey Amherst's admonitions, the road was considered poor even by contemporary standards. The 70-mile road became an important entry, but it did become an important entry way for Vermonters at the end of hostilities. And this is an original Crown Point marker. So there is a very active Crown Point Road Association. You can find them at crownpoint.org or crownpointroad.org, crownpointroad.org. They have found lots of markers. They have found some of the toll gates and pens. And they've put out some books about it. They've also erected a whole lot of markers over the years that are not the original ones, but Daughters of the American Revolution, the Crown Point Road Association. And I crossed the Crown Point Road when I was hiking the Long Trail in 2016, and this is it. It's a snowmobile path in the winter, but it doesn't look like much now. It was the main highway in its day. So other military roads in Vermont include the Hubbardton Road, which is where an important rear guard action took place prior to the Battle of Bennington during the Revolutionary War, when the retreating Americans delayed the British long enough to allow the another army from the south come up and prepare for the Battle of Bennington in August of 1775. And the road was abandoned and has become farmland and forest. The Bailey-Hazen Road, it was built at the command of General Washington to support the Continental Army's invasion of Quebec, planned for 1775, which it never took place. But Washington said that you may, in the month of November next, employ a small number of good men in cutting a road from your house to Canada, which you, with others, have reported to me to be practical. Your reasonable expenses of service will be allowed. That last sentence was very important because he was commissioning civilians to build this road, and the previous civilians who had started and built 6 miles of it quit because they hadn't been paid. Then there is the Albany military road, which went from Fort Dummer to Williamstown, Massachusetts, and ended at Fort Massachusetts, which is in North Adams, and all that remains of that is this chimney. The price chopper isn't even there anymore. So, and we'll come back to this one because this was a really important one. The American frontier. So the British Army had built all these military roads that allowed Vermonters, or people who were going to become Vermonters, to come here and settle. But the British never built roads for commerce. In fact, before the colonies gained independence, and Vermont was not a colony, they were forbidden to have interstate roads because all the raw material was supposed to go back to the motherland, be turned into finished goods in Britain and shipped back here for the colonials to buy. So this meant that in post-revolutionary America, roads were bad, worse, or non-existent. So we had local roads. But this is a map of Windham County, where I live. But it's pretty typical for much of Vermont. The land was granted to Benning Wentworth in New Hampshire and to Governor Clinton in New York. They sold it to land jobbers down in Manhattan who put the maps on the ground, on a table, on a flat surface, took a ruler and cut up 6 by 6 mile by 6 mile townships, because the theory was that if it was 6 miles, nobody was more than 3 miles from the town center. Clearly, they had no concept of the geography, because, and the reason for 3 miles was that meant everybody could walk to church, that the town center is where the meeting house would be, and everybody would be able to get there walking only 3 miles. That's not, in fact, what happened, because it was rarely practical. Most settlements occurred in small hamlets, and by the 18th century, people were settling near rivers for water power, and typically the sawmill was the first building erected, and then the grist mill, and so on. And it's what I call spider web development ensued, because everybody walked and they followed footpaths that led to the villages that sprung up near the mills. So this, again, this is Newfane, which in 1760 was settled on top of Newfane Hill, and in 1825 the buildings were slid down, mostly into the village of Newfane. You really can't see this, I'm sorry. It's often, I don't know why we don't have it. It's usually much more sharp. But there were hamlets. Newfane Village had a stream. Williamsville had a stream. At the end of the 18th century, it had 20 different industries. And then there's South Newfane and Brookside, which has since washed away. So this is an 1856 map. And this is Mount Holly, which will give you a better sense of all the different, that Mount Holly still has hamlets of Belmont, Healdville, Hortonville, and Tarbellville. But you can see pretty much, here's one, here's another one, here's a bigger town, little village. All these hamlets would have a church, they'd have the mills, and then, each one would have a little bit different flavor. So there was a great need for transportation, though, as people as the first settlers went from being subsistence farmers to generating a surplus, as they gained prosperity, not being able to get further than their local, to the nearest hamlet, or maybe the hamlet next over, became an impediment. So, you know, as long as people were coming into Vermont, it didn't matter. But, you know, they started to need, as agricultural production increased, they needed transportation, and the need became acute because even though most people grew food and kept livestock for their household use, and they had general stores that became trading posts, because you take your surplus and trade it for what couldn't be grown, like cloth, salt, and nails, rum, for instance. But so the first local roads went from the countryside towards the village center, and then they connected hamlet to hamlet. But it made for really bad roads. In 1798, after the Revolution, you know, it's after Vermont has become a nation. No, it's become a state by 1791. So this is seven years after statehood. Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University, described the road between Rutland and Middlebury as, quote, little wrought and of course indifferent, and the last part of the distance, for about 8 miles, was to us dangerous. Wherever a rill crosses the path, it becomes speedily soft and ultimately a quagmire. Sounds like mud season. And something had to be done. The first solution to the particular problem of surplus wheat was solved by brewing beer and distilling spirits. It was the beginning of value-added agriculture in Vermont, a tradition that continues today. By 1800, there were 200 distilleries in Vermont. But the next solution was to revive the old military roads into turnpikes. And I'm going to show you another, under the best circumstances, you can't really see this very well, but I want to tell you about the book this comes from. It's called it's a book called Roads in the Wilderness by 2 women, Bernice Barnett, and B.B. Woods, published in 1993. It's a little paperback. It is an extremely rare book. Your library might have it. There's a copy for sale at a used bookstore in Brattleboro for $30, and I just can't bring myself to buy it. But I've read it. So these 2 women set out to find the old turnpike, and in the process they find also the old military road that went from Brattleboro on the Connecticut River over to through Whitingham over to Beddington. So this is cut up into 2 sections. As said, it's not a good map, but I want you to know it crossed the southern part of Vermont, roughly where Route 9 goes now, and parts of it are Route 9 and parts of it are not. The old military roads like that one were turned into turnpikes. Now what's so interesting here is that we now just assume that roads will be publicly funded. But that was not the case, certainly, with the early turnpikes, the early roads, or with the railroads. So private corporations were chartered by a special act of the legislature as a means of financing roads in light of the citizen resistance to taxes. We still have that, but we seem to want roads more than we want our money. So they were privately financed, and they were very regulated. They had a construction schedule. They had construction standards. Vermont turnpikes had to be 60 feet wide with an 18-foot travel path. The number and size of the toll gates was specified in the charter, and there was public oversight built into the charter. The county courts were required to appoint three judicious freeholders to be inspectors of turnpike roads in each county, and the inspectors were appointed annually, and they could not be shareholders in any turnpike corporation. And they couldn't be connected in any way to a turnpike corporation, and they had to swear an oath saying so. The inspectors were required to investigate complaints and order repairs. They were empowered to throw open the gates and allow free passage until the repairs were made. And anyone obstructing an inspector or closing a gate an inspector had ordered open was subject to a fine of $200, which is a huge amount of money. That is the maximum I'm allowed to charge someone if I have to throw them out of town meeting, which I have never done. So that was very serious business. But the corporations also had rights. They had the right of appeal. They could set the rates that the turnpike users were charged according to what they were driving, and that's what this is, the number of horses they had, and if they were droving livestock or cattle. However, there was no charge for churchgoers or for farmers performing common labor on his own land, or anyone engaged in common and ordinary business of family concerns within the same town. Essentially, it was free local passage. But if you were moving through, you had to pay a toll. And those people had the right to swift passage. So a gatekeeper could be penalized for needlessly hindering travelers at the toll gates. Turnpike mania grabbed Vermont. From 1796 until 1806, the legislature chartered 91 turnpikes. Okay, and the Wyndham Turnpike, which is that one that went where Route 9 goes now in the across the southern part of the state, was the first one to receive its charter. It was supposed to go from Bennington to the east bank of the Deerfield River, but 3 years later, ground hadn't been broken. So the second charter was issued for the same route plus an extension east to Brattleboro. And it was the first chartered, but it was the second one built. And that, I tell you this because there's an echo with the coming of the railroad. The turnpikes turned out to be impractical. And by 1839, the legislature enacted a law giving county courts the power, quote, to take any real estate, easement, or franchise of any turnpike or other corporation when, in their judgment, the public good requires a public highway. And the provision applied to the whole road. That idea of public good will again return in the beginning of the 20th century. Despite this possibility of a turnpike being made public, 16 more turnpikes were chartered between 1839 and 1874, and the last turnpike to be chartered went through the notch at Smuggler's Notch from Stowe to Underhill. But not all the turnpikes that were chartered were built, and not all those that were built have survived. But some have become local roads, some have become rail beds, and some have been abandoned and disappeared into the forest. Turnpikes did have impact on settlement. Because the turnpike roads in many cases are main thoroughfares, as in Route 9, or they're tourist roads like 108 through the Notch. Following the turnpike mania came the Canal Craze and water transport. So it was the beginning of we'll get to it. So Lake Champlain is this long highway, north-south route, and the Connecticut River is this long north-south route. They really hoped that they could connect the two and connect each of them to bigger places. In 1823, the first section of the Erie Canal opened from Rome to Albany, and it was an immense success. It's hard to imagine what an incredible success it was. New York State financed the canal without any federal aid, and they collected $1 million in tolls in their first year. It was completed in 1825. It's 350 miles long. It earned its entire cost back in 10 years, and it made New York City the major port and center of trade that it has been ever since. So everyone wanted a canal, and Vermont wanted to connect to the Erie Canal. And in fact, its one successful canal did that very thing. The first it connected the southern end of Lake Champlain to the Hudson River and the Erie Canal. It is still operational for pleasure crafts. It's no longer a commercial waterway. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on canals, just to tell you a couple of good stories, because canals were a flash in the pan and they did not really impact settlement. But there was hope. There was hope to build a canal, to build locks, enough locks to make the 400 miles of the Connecticut River navigable. And the Connecticut River is 406 miles long. It's the longest river in New England, and it was the expressway of the 18th century. It took less time to get to Boston or New York from Springfield, Massachusetts by water than by land. But the problem of creating a canal system had to do with interstate commerce. It was New Hampshire and Vermont could agree, but Massachusetts and Connecticut really didn't get along. But there were some other problems. So the attempts to build the canals around the rapids on the Connecticut River failed due to a combination of a failure to cooperate and also stupidity. And there were 6 falls from top to bottom. There's one in South Hadley, Mass., Millers Falls, Massachusetts, Bellows Falls, Queechee Falls, Alcott's Falls at White River, and Barnett. And that's just north of Massachusetts. Well, no, that includes Massachusetts, but not Connecticut. But the first steamboat, the Connecticut River Company's first steamboat, called the Barnett, was a flat-bottomed 75-foot stern wheeler that only needed 2 feet of water to float. It made its maiden journey in November of 1826, got delayed in Brattleboro by ice. It reached Bellows Falls in December, mid-December, and that's when they discovered it was too wide to go through the canal. The Vermont was a small stern wheeler with a 12-inch draft. It made it to Windsor and got stuck in the locks. And then the John Ledyard was built to fit through all the river locks, but it ran aground in Wells River. So no steamboat ever made it to Barnett. But by far the most ambitious and doomed canal was the one across Vermont, the canal across Vermont. So in 1824, John Quincy Adams, who was the President of the United States at the time, sent a team to conduct, engineers to conduct a topographical survey of Vermont for a canal. And the Onion River Navigation and Towpath Company was incorporated in later that year with great enthusiasm, followed by 4 years of silence. The surveys didn't even begin until 1829 in a search for the elusive Northwest Passage through the Onion River Valley. There were huge engineering challenges, which you can see, well, maybe you could see in this map, Remember those mountains? So getting from Wells River, which is there's Barnett, there's Wells River to Montpelier is really not such a hard thing. There only needed 2 locks. But you'll notice this mountain range here. So from Montpelier to the lake was going to require somewhere between 6 to 8 locks. It's a huge drop. It was going to be so they were looking for they looked at 5 possible routes, including one all the way up through Reigate, which is pretty far north. And there is a Mr. James Whitlow of Reigate who wrote to a member of the Canal Committee saying that the canal would never touch the county of Caledonia. In my opinion, there are 2 much better routes. And then he went on to say, I am so old that I shall never see the work completed, but to make a beginning, I enclose to you a $3 bill, which I believe will be the greatest donation you will get from any individual in this town. The canal was never constructed because the canal craze was over, ended, and the railroads came to Vermont with the same kind of enthusiasm. So, and the railroads worked very similarly to the turnpikes, that they had to get a charter from the legislature, and they had a certain amount of time to build to build them. And the Vermont Central Railroad got the first charter, but it expired before they started construction. Sound familiar? And before they got a second charter, and before they could finish it, the Connecticut and Passumpsic, thank you, River Railroad was built by Erasmus Fairbanks. So what you have is Charles Payne, Central Vermont, the Connecticut and Passumpsic Railroad, Fairbanks, Erasmus Fairbanks, and then you have Vermont Central. He's the successor. This is Gregory Smith. The 3 men were all presidents of railroads, and they were also all governors of Vermont. And I don't think it was quite coincidental. The first 2 railroads were finished within a couple of weeks with each other, but for many years, and there were many others. There was one from Rutland north. But because they were all individual companies, they all had their own stations. And in Burlington, for years and years and years, if you wanted to change trains, you had to walk across town from one station to another. The railroads, so the other thing is that Charles Payne had a mill. He lived in Northfield, Vermont. And so that is where the rail yards and where Vermont Central Railroad was established first. What was that? I think that White River became a really important junction, but Payne had a big mill in Northfield, and his corporate headquarters were there until Smith took it over, and then he moved it to St. Albans. But I'll go look it up, and I'll give you information. We'll trade, because if I'm wrong, I want to make sure that I correct it. Yeah, I have the first railroads being completed in 1849. The first charters were 1833, but it took a while for them to get their acts together before they were completed. So let's talk. Let me finish. We'll talk. Maybe I'm misinforming you, but I thought I had pretty good authority here from the Vermont Historical Society, mostly. You say no. All right, well, hold that thought. What I have is that by 1851, the Vermont Central Railroad introduces refrigerator cars to transport 8 tons of butter a week to eastern markets. Then, and then the Vermont and Canada Railroad and the Vermont Central Railroad connect Essex Junction with a spur in Burlington, providing a link from Boston to Canada and west and the west. And then there was a Grand Trunk Railroad that's built in Portland, Maine to Montreal, with a main junction in Island Pond, which was the halfway point, and becomes a major rail center. There were towns. How did this impact settlement? Towns that were on the railroad had a way to get merchandise out, so they prospered. A town like Randolph, which is up 89 from here, actually moved their village from, it had started out where the railroad depot came, and they decided, we don't like that. They moved up the hill, and so they could have a town a little further away from the noise and of the railroad. And then during the last quarter of the century, there was railroad consolidation. By 1894, Central Vermont Railroad under Smith it controlled most of Vermont's rails. There were 189 locomotives, most of them switched from wood to coal. There were 123 pieces of passenger equipment. Passenger cars were heated, big boon, and there were 3,800 freight cars and about 2,400 employees. So the railroad was big business. But there were also small railroads. They weren't all big ones. Vermont used to have quite a few. This was the West River Railroad. It was intended to run from Whitehall, New York to Brattleboro, and but it was only completed as far as Londonderry. It ran for 36 miles along the West River, and there was the first history of it written, gave it the title, was published with the title 36 Miles of Trouble, because it did have quite a bit of trouble. It was undercapitalized from the beginning, so it was built as a narrow gauge, which meant that every time it got to Brattleboro, everything had to be taken off and reloaded onto the standard gauge main line. That was changed in 1905. I've interviewed people no longer living who rode it. It was in operation until 1936, sketchy operation, and then in 1939, all the steel was sold to Japan. Currently, there are sections of the old road bed that have been turned into a rail trail for, and there's efforts to connect them. So, while the railroads were flourishing, the state roads were not. But cars need roads. Unlike the turnpikes and the canals and the railroads, which were all private corporations, it was the state and the federal government that paid for roads. So this is not far from my house, 1909. In 1894, as a forward-looking measure, Vermont passed its first law governing motor vehicles. In 1894, the year this law was passed, there were no known motor vehicles in the state. But by 1898, there was a car, and in 1899, a second. So there wasn't much need for roads yet. But by 1904, there was a law requiring registration, and there were 373 cars registered. By 1913, there were 4,500 cars registered, averaging 1 car for every 78.5 people. 1923 is the first tax on gasoline. There's 61,000 cars by then, or vehicles, and there's 67,000 licensed drivers. In 1927, there are 357,000 people living in Vermont, and there's very little paved road. There's local control was fierce on the town level, and towns generally took care of their own roads, their own schools, their own social services. And towns were as allergic to state control of local issues as the state was allergic to federal control. In January of, this is important, the timeline here is important. In January of 1927, Governor John Weeks favored modernizing Vermont's roads. He says in his inaugural address, he proposed a tax for the expansion of hard-surfaced road. He said, for the necessary and convenient purposes of daily use, as a public investment and as a means of attracting visitors who may become permanent residents, good roads are no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Some of the things he said were said earlier about the canals and the turnpikes, and some of them have been said since Governor Weeks. But the towns didn't want to give up the local control in return for state funding. And the state didn't want to give up local control for federal funding. So, but that all changed in November of the same year when there was the flood. It washed away the town's reluctance to accept state aid and the state's reluctance to accept federal aid. So there were 1,258 bridges destroyed or damaged in the flood. And Weeks said, bridges and highways are no longer built and maintained principally for the good and convenience of the people of the town where they are located, but for the good and convenience of the people of our entire state. And the first statute enacted in the special session of the legislature after the flood was to aid all municipalities to the full extent of the flood damage to public highways and bridges. All the work was to be supervised by the State Highway Board, and the State Emergency Board had the ultimate authority over both the State Highway Board and the local select boards. So it was the beginning of centralization of state power over roads. The same thing happened at the federal level because in 1926 there had been a federal study of Vermont roads and a proposal to improve Vermont roads, which Vermont turned down. So it was really, the flood is the first time Vermont ever accepted federal aid. And during the Great Depression, there was a proposal to build the Green Mountain Parkway along the spine of the Green Mountains. It was going to be 1,000 feet wide, and it was going to be similar to the Skyline Drive in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. It was proposed in 1933 as a public works project that would bring federal money into Vermont, bring tourists into Vermont, provide jobs, and stimulate Vermont's economy. It was hotly contested. Supporters for the project included a railroad engineer whose idea it was, named Colonel William Wilgus. FDR gave $50,000 for a feasibility study to be performed by the National Park Service and the Bureau of Public Roads. The Vermont Governor Stanley Wilson supported it. James Taylor, the founder of the Green Mountain Club and the father of the Long Trail, supported it. The State Planning Board, the Burlington Press, the Brattleboro Reformer, the Bennington Banner, and the Vermont author Dorothy Canfield Fisher. They touted the benefits: federal dollars, increased tourism, jobs related to tourism, open Vermont to outsiders, expose Vermonters to outsiders, soften Vermont's reputation as a provincial backwater. But there were people who were vehemently opposed. The Speaker of the House, Judge Ernest Moore, the Rutland Herald, Orton Vrest of the Vermont Country Store didn't want to make Vermont into a Coney Island. The author and Nobel laureate Sinclair Lewis and members of the Green Mountain Club, they were opposed. They said it would ruin Vermont's ridgeline, it would cause car pollution, noise pollution, loss of rural solitude. They didn't want the strings attached to federal money, and it would emphasize the socio-cultural and economic split between the east and west sides of the state. The deal was Vermont would invest $500,000 in the project and the federal government would invest $18 million. It pitted environmentalists against isolationists, economic development during the Great Depression. Vermont took very little money. It was not a big New Deal state. It was a really hot public debate, either for or against it. And in 1935, it was defeated in the House, 126 to 111, but it passed in the Senate. So there was a special session of the legislature in the fall of 1935, and the House approved at that time 131 to 105 with a caveat that there would be a referendum at town meeting that March. So the Burlington Free Press called it generally viewed as the most controversial issue which has been placed before the people in many years. And the outcome was 30,897 in favor, 42,318 opposed. The Parkway failed. So there are theories about that. The Vermonters' traditional dislike of spending money, Vermonters worried about the local effects of the highway, while the state thought it was going to be statewide pretty good. There was very clear regional opposition within Vermont. It was not well supported in towns on the east of the state or towns in the east or south. It was better supported in the west and the north where the Parkway was to be built. I mention this because it has nothing to do with settlement and everything to do with Vermont attitudes towards highways. But what changed the patterns of settlement most, especially in our lifetimes, was the building of the National Defense Highway, also known as the interstates. What was Vermont like before the interstate? It's hard to imagine. So, the Federal Aid to Highway Act of 1956 created the interstate highway system, also known as the Eisenhower National Defense Highway System, because Eisenhower took a motorcade in 1919 across the country from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco on the Lincoln Highway, which was part dirt, and it took 2 months. So Eisenhower was in the European Theater of Operations during World War II and saw the Autobahns. And he said, the old convoy had started me thinking about good 2-lane highways, but Germany had made me see the wisdom of broader ribbons across the land. It was funded by the Highway Trust Fund with a 90-10 split, meaning the federal government paid for 90%, the state paid for 10%. It was 41,000 miles of highway. It was going to reduce the transcontinental drive time from 2 months to 5 days. It's supposed to have military benefits. It's the largest peacetime construction in U.S. history. They are limited access highways, meaning you can only get on or off at an exit. Restricted entrances and exits. There are no traffic lights except in Reno, Nevada. There are 2 lanes, a travel lane and a passing lane, limited lower street speed restrictions, and they're uniform, the same green signs throughout the country. They're designed for safety and speed with a 24-foot lane width, a 50-foot median where possible. Vermont has 323 miles of interstate. It takes 40 acres a mile and 150 acres for interchange. Vermont's has views and vistas. Vermont's medians are planted with shrubs to specific needs, like to block headlights of oncoming cars, and it was mostly a positive response. People in mid-century Vermont mostly thought interstate was going to be a good thing for the state. It represented progress, modernization, and connection. Elbert Moulton, the economic development chief under 4 governors, believed the highway would bring Vermont out of the sticks so it could join the economic mainstream of the country. The executive secretary of the State Transportation Board at the time said, the interstate was seen as the answer to many, if not most, of Vermont's problems. It was universally applauded. Most people settled with the state when their land was needed, including Senator George Aiken, whose family's land in Putney was needed. And Aiken said, "We're on the verge of the greatest development Vermont has ever seen." But just like those Indians who said, we're now your enemies if you build the Crown Point Road, there were people who resisted the interstate as well. One, famously, was Romain Tenney. He was born in May of 1900 on a 75-acre farm his family had owned since 1892, and he had lived there his entire life. He was a bachelor farmer. He lived in the family farmhouse without electricity, without a car. He milked 25 cows by hand. He cut hay with horsepower, and he cut firewood with a saw and axe. His house and barn were on the main road, Route 131, exactly where the surveyors planned the southbound exit of I-91 that's now Exit 8. The road would bisect his farm, and he refused the state's money. He stayed in the house. He refused neighbors and families' help. He refused to sell the antiques in the house, and on September 12th of 1964, he set his house and barn on fire in an act of suicide. So it was supposed to take 10 years to build the interstate in Vermont and have a 20-year capacity. In 1958, 9 miles of interstate opened, 7 miles from the Massachusetts border to Brattleboro and 2 miles from the Canadian border to Derby. The last section through St. Johnsbury was finished in 1978, 20 years later. It cost about $1 million a mile. I-89 is the famous and difficult east-west route, but modern cars can negotiate steeper grades even than railroads. But they all follow the similar routes that the Indians and the turnpikes and the railroads all followed. The interstates and cars conquer the geographical barriers of the mountains, and I-91 was initially planned as just a one lane in each direction, but it was it obviously is a 2-lane highway. It has huge social and economic and environmental impacts. It changed the way dairy farming took place in Vermont. Bulk tanks replaced milk cans, and it introduced tourism, including skiing. The interstates changed settlement patterns and land usage. The land around the exits became developed often before Act 250 as sprawl and commercial zones. And it was during the heyday of homogenization of American culture. There was television, there was Howard Johnson's, where the menu was the same no matter where you were in the country. Harry Reasoner spoke in the Midwestern so-called no accent, and that's what we heard on TV. So this is Brattleboro, and I know the people who used to farm this land. It's beautiful Connecticut Valley farmland. It's now largely paved. There's a lot of traffic on it. Until the interstates came, most methods of transportation increased established settlement patterns. The military roads went from fort to fort, the turnpikes connected villages, the railroads connected towns, but the interstates changed the landscape and patterns of development with pavement, strip malls, national franchises, And they, along with television, really helped homogenize American culture. But Vermont is still, well, I-91 is your northwest passage. 89 is the east-west passage. Both follow routes of railroads, which followed the routes of the military roads, which followed the routes of the Indians long before the Europeans arrived. The interstates are here, probably for another 100 years. This bridge was just completed, and it's supposed to have a 100-year lifespan. It replaced a bridge over the West River that had a 50-year lifespan and served for a little more than 60. And maybe, yeah, 60. And when this bridge opened in March of 2017, they invited the public up to walk on it before it opened to traffic. It was a bitter cold day. It was fantastic. The yellow vests are some of the people who worked on the bridge. They were stationed there to answer questions. We were bussed up and bussed off. It was really quite wonderful. And from the top of the bridge, you can see Route 30, which followed an Indian trail, which followed the river, which was used before there was a trail and during the winter. So, and right out of the frame is the railroad. So from this bridge, you can see like 250 years of transportation history, of European transportation history, plus imagine all those years before. There's the railroad, which is the rail trail, with a great sign because they used this as an access to build the new bridge. But Vermont is still a small town. Well, it used to be, Vermont used to be a state of small towns, but now it is a small town itself. A small town, I define a small town as a place where you don't just know whose car is passing you, you know where it's going. And that happened to me one day on the interstate. I was right down the road here, over there I think, where I-89 connects to 91. And I had just been in Washington, D.C. for a week, where there's local roads have 3 lanes in each direction. I was frazzled. I mean, I don't do traffic. And so I'm driving up to Johnson on I-91 on a Monday morning. There's no traffic. There's not another car on the road until I get to the Cloverleaf. And this little red Jetta, it overtakes me. And I know who it is, and I know where he is going, because I knew Peter Shumlin, and he was president of the Senate, and he was headed to Montpelier, and he was speeding. But so what's next? Well, I have hope for the information highway. If we could only get high-speed internet. Do you have high-speed internet here? You do? Sort of.
Depends on where you live.
Yeah. 9 years ago, I got high-speed internet. It's not high-speed anymore. So it's a problem. But I have hope. If we could get high-speed internet everywhere, the small towns, like the one I live in that now only has a post office with limited hours, and the general store is now a restaurant that serves dinner 4 nights a week. We could see people working at home. We could see less use of cars. Maybe we'd get a store back. Maybe we could have enough people to staff the local fire department. We could have people to be in the community and volunteer and have small town community life again. That's my hope. But it would be part of the whole eating local, the slow food movement, the slow money movement, political disaffection with the federal government. We could have real local community. Maybe or maybe not. We'll see. So that's my presentation for today. These are some of the things I write. I blog every Wednesday, but maybe tomorrow will be Wednesday. And I write about the human condition often, as it is in Vermont. Okay, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Yeah.
How popular were shunpikes?
Shunpikes. Well, shunpikes were, I'm going to, think I'll just close that. Yeah. Shunpikes were the way people went around the tolls. Okay, so they, like most it's not surreptitious, but like most ways around the rules, there's not a lot of data on who, you know, it's not like there were those cameras that take a picture of your license plate when you go through a toll. If you were going through the woods and trying to avoid the toll, maybe someone knew and reported you, but I think mostly you got away with it. It would have been hard going. Yes, sir, you had...
Yeah, I was going to ask you, that poor fellow that committed suicide, I think his property was down around the Hartford exit.
It was exit 8.
Was that a different one?
Was there more than one?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so there was...
Oh, okay.
I know about Roman Tenney, and his
Oh, so he was further south?
further south, near Weathersfield.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd like to know the Ascutney exit. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What era were the King's Highways developed? If you see the signs still, was that just generally pre-revolution, or was there?
Is that in Vermont or in New Hampshire?
One that goes through Hartford.
Tell me about it. I don't know about it.
Starts on the Connecticut River,
Uh-huh.
heads west. And there's parts of it in Concord.
I don't know when that was built. I would, obviously before 1776, probably even earlier than that. I know there's one called the Dartmouth Highway in New Hampshire. And I would guess that, I mean, this is just a guess, is that the King's Highway would be something that Benning Wentworth got money for from George III and used. My guess is it was also military to start with. But I don't know about that one. I'll look into it. It's interesting. Yeah.
The first railroad that laid rail was to Vermont Central.
Mm-hmm.
They finished, they went from White River to Bethel.
Hmm.
And they ended with laying rail in 1848. They ran the first train same year.
So I'm wondering where you found that out, because it's not the history book.
Vermont Railway Historical Society.
Uh-huh.
Book number 1 by Jones. Robert C. Jones.
Robert
Jones.
Robert
written
Jones.
Lots of railroad books.
Uh-huh. It's not, was not in the history books I consulted, which is interesting.
In the
Yeah.
Vermont Trivia Quiz,
Mm-hmm.
they talk about the first passenger train in Vermont
Mm-hmm.
was from here to Bethel.
Well, if I lived here, I would have great local pride in that too. So I will look into this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and make this, you know, find out if I.
One other one, the Sunset Railroad came into White River in 1848 and built this double-track covered bridge.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only one in the state or the country. I'm not sure of that yet.
Is it at the Shelburne Museum now?
The bridge?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. That was replaced by the B&F in 1913 or 1912.
Yeah. There is a very wide covered bridge at the Shelburne Museum. I haven't been there in years, but I wonder if it's.
Could tell you the only thing
That
the
one.
railroad they have is the Gertie Buck from the Woodstock Railroad.
Mm-hmm. All right. I did want to tell you, which maybe you've already been, but the West River Railroad, the Windham County Historical Society has bought the Newfane Depot and turned it into a museum for the West River Railroad, and it's open from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and it's quite wonderful. They even have track, and they have one of the very few surviving water towers in the Northeast with the big tub and lots of stuff about the railroad. It served 10 towns along the valley, and so if you get down that way. Other questions or comments?
How successful, how profitable were the toll roads that were built? I mean, they do a lot of work using private funding to build them.
That's a good question. I don't know how profitable they were, and I don't know how many shunpikes there were around them. And obviously the gates were open to all local traffic. So, and at some point, local government saw that roads, and not just in Vermont, but generally, people saw that roads were a public thoroughfare, which is not the case for the railroads. Which is interesting, you know, and there was a great need for these.
And you said the Indian Trail, that was, and you showed a picture of a tunnel.
Yeah.
Obviously, the Indians didn't go.
No, the Indians went up. Mount Hoosac is this very short, steep. It's 5 miles from one side over to the other, but the west side is this very steep pass. And in living history, there was still a Native American who would sit there, and he would, I don't know that he charged anybody, but maybe misled them. I don't know.
They took a steep path over the hill rather than around the hill?
I think around was not an option. I think it's part of a range. It was the shortest way over, was essentially the Appalachian Range, as far as I understand. Really good. I can look up my source. There's a really good article in it about it. Afterwards, I'll find in it. I don't think it's the Vermont Historical Society. I think it's another historical society's article. It's very good about that. Other comments, questions?
If you want, we have refreshments in here, and
That's what they came for.
yeah.
They've just been waiting for me to stop talking.
Don't forget to turn in your survey.